All right, in this video, we're going to cover some of the material from chapters 14 and 17. There's a lot of material in these two chapters, but I'm going to select some of the more interesting and relevant information to human living nowadays in the United States and talk about it. So we're first going to start with chapter 14, which is on race and racism, and then turn to chapter 17, which is on drugs and guns. All right, so let's just start with the question, what is race? And you can see the core idea of race, the definition here, which is a fine definition of what race is as far as things go. I guess the problem that this definition results in is that there's no scientifically precise way to specify what the biological or cultural traits are that a person needs to have in order to count as a member of a certain racial group. For a few decades in the 20th century, there was a whole scientific endeavor called race science, where biologists were trying to look at human DNA samples and discover a genetic basis for race. And this research paradigm ended up, sort of dissolving after it failed, because it was discovered that there is no genetic basis for race and that human beings at the level of DNA are basically 99.9% identical to one another. Right? So there is no biological basis for drawing racial distinctions between people. And so this realization led many thinkers about race to conclude that race isn't this biologically real thing, and rather it's what's sometimes called a social construct, which means that race can still be real. It's just not something that exists independently of what we care about. And so the reason why we tend to draw the distinctions that we do when it comes to putting people in different racial categories, the reason why we do that largely depends on our interests, what we care about, what goals we have as humans, and historically people have separated people into different racial groups in different ways depending on what they were interested in or what they cared about. So for instance, it used to be the case that on the US Census, there were three socio-racial categories. There was slaves was a racial category, free whites, and then pretty much everybody else. Right, so there are only three, but nowadays we have more than three racial categories on the US Census. Obviously, people cared more about the distinction between slave and non-slave in the American South, in the 19th century, 18th century, and so they had different racial categories than the ones we have today. We might wonder about the ones we have today. Right? Like, take the racial category Asian, for instance. What exactly does a person from South Korea share with a person from India, with a person from Kazakhstan, say? You have three radically different sets of cultures. The physical characteristics tend to be different in these three different countries. What exactly unifies the people that come from these three countries? Right? We call them all Asian. Right? That's a racial category. So you might think that there's really nothing interesting that unifies these people together, nothing distinctly biological or cultural, and yet they count as members of the same racial group. All right, so the ways in which we've distinguished between people in different racial groups, very kind of arbitrary in many ways. We could draw the distinctions differently. We don't. But the take-home point here is that race is a socially constructed kind of thing. It could, change in the next few decades, how many racial groups we have, who counts as a member of what racial group, depending on what humans come to care about. Right, so it's not this biologically real thing. All right, that's probably a good thing that there is no genetic basis for race, because part of the motivation for engaging in race science anyways in the 20th century, the motivation from a lot of researchers was to try and find a biological basis for discriminatory forms of treatment. And since it turned out that there is no interesting genetic difference between people of different racial groups, that implies that there is no biological basis for treating people differently than one another. It's a good thing. All right. In any case, racism still persists nowadays, and so we're going to draw a distinction between two different kinds of racism. One is called individual racism, and the other is institutional racism. What's the main difference? So the main difference is this. Individual racism is person-to-person kind of racism. So one person calls another person a racial slur or doesn't hire them because they don't like people of that race. That's individual racism. Institutional racism is a kind of racism that arises from the way society is structured. And so it's possible to have institutional racism even in a world where nobody is, implicitly or explicitly racist. They don't have any racist beliefs or feelings or anything like that. There could still be institutional racism in such a world. So the best way to understand what that kind of racism is to look at some examples. And so that's what we're going to do now. All right, so one example of some data that's used to support this idea that institutional racism is real is the racial wealth gap. And this is the gap in overall wealth between white families and black families. And you can see there's a huge discrepancy here between the two bars. So that's one kind of data point to think about in the context of institutional racism. All right. In addition to differences in overall wealth, we also can take into consideration the differences across racial groups in terms of hourly earnings. So you see that on the left-hand side. You can also look at differences in imprisonment rates between people of various racial or ethnic groups. And these are just some more examples that are suggestive of institutional racism. All right, it's important to keep in mind that race doesn't always explain everything, right? So it might be the case that there are large differences in wealth and in earning outcomes between people of various groups in our society, but maybe it's not to be explained in terms of race always. Right, so for instance, think about something like the differences in imprisonment rates that we just saw on the last slide. One kind of explanation that people sometimes give is something along the following lines. Well, it's not the fact that somebody's like of a particular race that's explaining why they're being imprisoned. Maybe what explains these differential rates across different racial groups in terms of imprisonment is simply the fact that people in certain racial or ethnic groups tend to be poorer than others. And so, like, if you are poorer, you might be more likely to be arrested for having committed a crime because you, just out of necessity, sometimes resort to crime to a higher degree than somebody who's just already well off. And they don't have to resort to crime to, say, feed their family or anything like that. Right? Or they don't grow up in a neighborhood where there's high crime already. Right? If they're well off and they live, out in the suburbs or something like that. Right? So this is another possible explanation of the kind of data that we're looking at that would be what we might call a class-based explanation. Right? So the class-based explanation might work in the case of imprisonment rates. It's not really an explanation that would work for differences in wealth because, well, of course, you can't explain differences in wealth by appealing to class. That would be just like a circular explanation. But if we tried to use the class-based explanation in the case of imprisonment, we would have to come to terms with data like what we see here that suggests that even once you control for household income, it's still the case that black men are imprisoned at higher rates than white men. Right? So that's, again, another set of data that would be suggestive of the idea that society is set up to allow people of some racial groups to succeed while it doesn't necessarily help people in other racial groups. It's suggestive of institutional racism. That's the idea. All right, some more data. So police killings in the US are quite high in comparison to the rates at which people are killed by the police in other countries. What you see on the right-hand side is just a kind of illustration of how people in certain racial and ethnic groups can be more likely to be shot by police than people in the other racial groups. And does this mean that there's racism in policing? Well, maybe it is suggestive of it, but we can't necessarily conclude that there is racism in policing because of this graph right here. And the reason why, I mean, just think like, the police end up shooting lots of people in this country, but 93% of unarmed American citizens shot by the cops in the U.S. are men, even though men only comprise 50% of the population. Does that mean that there's sexism in policing? Well, no, it doesn't. So maybe there are similar ways to explain the data that we see on the right-hand side without necessarily resorting to the idea that there's racism in policing. Right, this issue of racism in policing and what explains why there's so many police killings in the U.S., why is it the case that black citizens are more likely to be shot by the police than white citizens? It's obviously a very controversial issue. There are some explanations of the issue cashed out in terms of institutional racism, where the guiding idea is that there's racism in policing. That's what's going on. There are other possible explanations, though. All right, so here's some more data. And the data on this slide says that if you just look at who is being shot by the police in people of different racial groups per 10,000 stops and arrests, so per 10,000 white citizens that are stopped or arrested, how many of them get shot by the police? Or per 10,000 black citizens or Hispanic citizens that get stopped or arrested, how many of them tend to get shot by the police? What this data says is that the ratio at which people get shot by the police once they're stopped or arrested across all racial groups in the U.S. is surprisingly consistent. Right, so what does that suggest? It suggests that the source of the problem when it comes to racial differences in police killings, the source of the problem seems to be prior to the stop or arrest. In other words, maybe the problem has something to do with like over-policing certain communities, right? Racial minority communities, looking for crime there to a higher degree than cops are looking for crime in, wealthy white suburban neighborhoods, something like that. So, yeah, what we're trying to figure out here is just like, given that there is a problem of police killings, what's the source of the problem? It might be institutional racism at the level of how police behave after they stop or arrest somebody, but this set of data seems to suggest that's not the correct explanation. So maybe there's institutional racism at the level of police deciding where they're going to look for crime. Right, there's a ton more that could be said about institutional racism and different possible explanations of this or that data point. We could say a lot more, but we're just really like skimming the surface when it comes to institutional racism, just to give you the basic idea of what it is, how it differs from individual racism. There's a ton of literature out there that you could read, books that you could read if you're interested in the issue. I have my own recommendations. Lots of good educational videos on YouTube about this stuff too. Lots of bad videos on YouTube about this stuff too. You have to be careful. But one potential way of dealing with institutional racism is to have policies that try to correct for it, and these policies are sometimes known as affirmative action policies. Right, so the ideals guiding affirmative action policies are equal opportunity for people, equal respect for all people, and there are two different kinds of affirmative action, and we're going to talk about the two different kinds. The first kind is called weak affirmative action, and it's a kind of policy that tries to end discriminatory practices without giving preferential treatment to anybody based on their racial group, their ethnic group, their gender group. Right, so think about something like ending Jim Crow law, ending segregation law, in the American South in the 60s. Right? That is an example of weak affirmative action. Tries to promote equal opportunity and end discrimination without giving any preferential treatment to any particular group. By contrast, and this is a controversial kind of affirmative action, strong affirmative action does favor particular individuals because of their race or gender or ethnicity. So think about something like having a special scholarship program for only students of a particular racial group. So like Harvard was recently sued, for instance, because it was discovered that Harvard has been and continues to engage in strong affirmative action when deciding who they're going to admit into Harvard. So they have what's called a quota system in place where they want a very diverse student body. And so they will try to get a certain percentage of individuals from each racial group into Harvard. And it was a group of Asian American parents and Asian parents who sued Harvard saying that they were discriminating against Asian and Asian American applicants because Harvard thought they had already admitted enough Asian and Asian American students, and they met their quota. And so you had students who had really high test scores, really good GPA, like stellar candidates on paper in terms of their application, but they weren't being admitted because Harvard had already met the quota for Asian and Asian American students. All right, so that's a kind of strong affirmative action policy, gives preferential treatment to someone based on their race, ethnicity, or gender. All right, so some of the arguments in favor of strong affirmative action, well, pretty much all of them appeal to ideals of equal opportunity. The idea is that you can level the playing field when you have strong affirmative action in society. The main arguments against strong affirmative action have to do with the idea that people should just get what they deserve. You should be able to get into Harvard if you look good on paper. Right? It doesn't matter what you look like in person. But if you have good test scores, good GPA and whatnot, then you merit or deserve getting into Harvard. And your race or gender ethnicity should have nothing to do with it. Right? So there are two different kind of theories of what the just or fair society looks like. One is called a merit-based theory. You can see how the merit-based theory would naturally lend itself to being anti-strong affirmative action. There's also an equality theory of justice. So if we take equality as our guiding ideal when it comes to thinking about the just or fair society, then leveling the playing field is going to be a huge concern. Right. So yeah, these are the two main theories of justice that give rise to kind of different takes or attitudes on whether strong affirmative action is morally justified. Right, so a concern for equal opportunity, that's one of the main guiding concerns in support of strong affirmative action to make things fair. Also, the idea or ideal of compensatory justice, so giving people compensation for having wronged them historically, is another kind of guiding ideal behind strong affirmative action. We need to make amends for having treated racial minorities cruelly, unjustly in the past. That's another kind of support for strong affirmative action. Or the simple idea that having diversity in the population is a good thing. That's another kind of metric by which we can judge whether or not an affirmative action policy is good, right? Does it support diversity? If yes, then it's a good thing. It's another argument for strong affirmative action. Right, but kind of going back to this merit-based theory of the just society, the critics of strong affirmative action say that it's a kind of reverse discrimination. Right? Why should somebody not get into a school like Harvard or not get a scholarship or not get a job opportunity just because they happen to be of a particular race or gender or ethnicity? Right? According to this critique, it's always inherently wrong to treat people in a certain kind of way, in a different way, because of their race, gender, ethnicity. We should treat everybody equally and give people what they deserve based on their skills, talents, abilities, experiences, so on and so forth. All right, we're going to say a little bit about Chapter 17 now. So Chapter 17 deals with drugs, guns, and issues of personal choice, freedom, liberty. And you might wonder, like, why are we talking about these two things in the same chapter? Like drugs and guns, aren't they totally different kinds of things? Yes, they are, but the arguments, the ethical arguments pertaining to what the law should say about drugs and guns are surprisingly quite similar in many respects. That's why we're treating these two topics in tandem. All right, so one kind of deeper explanation for why we're treating these two topics in tandem is that the concerns with respect to the drugs issue and the concerns with respect to the guns issue are broadly similar. On the one hand, you have a concern for having a society where people live well, where they don't die young of drug overdoses or die from being shot unnecessarily. That's one set of concerns, so well-being, safety, things like that. And then on the other hand, you also have this concern for not interfering in people's private lives too much. You have concerns over personal freedom. As long as somebody isn't harming other people or violating other people's rights, shouldn't U.S. adults be free to do pretty much whatever they want? All right, so that's the kind of competing set of issues here. On the one hand, well-being and safety, and on the other hand, individual freedom and choice. All right, so with respect to drugs, lots of people die in the U.S. each year from various kinds of drug. In this chapter, when we use the word drug, we are referring not only to currently illegal drugs like heroin, cocaine, various psychedelics, but also alcohol, nicotine. These are drugs too. Marijuana, that's a drug. Um, Lots of people die from drug overdose in the U.S., but significantly more people die from legal drugs in the U.S. Like, look at how many people die from cigarette smoking. Right? Or think about other potentially dangerous behaviors, like just eating a bunch of junk food all the time, eating a bunch of fast food all the time. Right? Hundreds of thousands of people die each year in the U.S. from conditions caused by poor diet. Right? So how's that relevant here? Well, you might think that if the government should be in the business of enacting laws that prevent us from doing things that can be harmful to ourselves, then if there are laws against using drugs like cocaine because they're harmful, then maybe there should also be laws against eating too many Cheetos or eating too much McDonald's, because of course those things can also cause harm to a person too. On the flip side, you might say, well, the fact that it should be totally legal to eat however much McDonald's you want or however many Cheetos you want, because this is a free country, that suggests that maybe a law against using cocaine or heroin is an unjust law. Right? So that's kind of one angle to view laws against drugs from. All right, there are three different drug policies a country could have: legalization, criminalization, and decriminalization. We currently have a criminalization policy in this country. We've had what's called the war on drugs for a number of decades, and the war on drugs, at least to my mind, seems to have been a terrible failure. Right? We know that putting people in prison who have drug addictions does not help them with their addictions. We know that a huge number of people serving prison time, something like 20% of the prison population, is serving time for a use or possession offense of a drug. And we know that there are other countries that have decriminalized or even legalized drug use, and they haven't seen huge increases in drug usage rates. They haven't seen huge increases in drug overdose rates. So a good country to look at is Portugal is a case study. They decriminalized drugs in 2001, and they haven't seen huge numbers of new drug users or, a vast surge in drug overdose rates in Portugal. Right? So we currently have a criminalization policy, but should we? Is it a just policy to have? We're going to look at some arguments. All right, so in arguments over what our drug policy should be, two general ethical principles that get discussed are the harm principle and the paternalism principle. These principles can help us answer the question, under what circumstances is the government justified in telling us we can't do this, right? And this could be anything. Right? Here we're talking about drugs, but it could be anything at all. Right, so the harm principle is a principle that was first formulated by a philosopher named John Stuart Mill. Mill was a utilitarian philosopher. And according to Mill, the only legitimate reason the government can have for enacting a law that restricts individual choice and behavior is to prevent individuals from causing harm to other individuals. Right, that's the only legitimate reason the government has for enacting laws that restrict our choices and our freedoms. Right, there are two ways to apply the harm principle to questions of drug policy. One application of the principle supports criminalization of drugs. The idea here is that drug users do harm others in various ways. Maybe they steal things to feed their drug addictions. They might get into fights with other people when they're high, things like that. So that's one possible way of applying the harm principle to questions of drug policy. Right? Another way of applying the harm principle to questions of drug policy, and I think this is the more plausible application of the principle, like the more legitimate application of the principle, is that the harm principle actually supports decriminalization, maybe even legalization, because harms associated with drug use are often exaggerated. There's a stigma on drug users, right? So 90% of drug users don't have a drug problem. They don't get into fights with other people when they're high. Many illegal drugs don't cause people to become more aggressive anyways. Think about something like heroin, for instance. It like mellows people out, tremendously mellows people out. It's a very dangerous drug. Right? It's not like something to be recommended, but it's not the sort of thing that causes somebody to do what, like, Florida man who takes bath salts and then tries to eat somebody's face off did. Right? This is a story that you can Google search and read up about. But yeah, some drugs are very dangerous in the sense that they cause people to become very violent. But the standard list of mostly illegal drugs in the U.S., marijuana, heroin, cocaine, psychedelics, these are not drugs that are causing anybody to harm anybody else. Right? Now we have to be careful here. Sometimes people do stupid things when they're high, like just because a drug should be decriminalized or legalized, it doesn't mean that you should be able to like get behind the wheel of a car and drive while high, for instance. Right? So the same kinds of regulations we have with respect to alcohol consumption could also apply to the case of drug use too. Another thing to think about here with or in connection with this harm principle is that most of the harms associated with drug use are harms that are caused to the drug user by themselves. Right? So like if I take a bunch of heroin, I'm harming myself. Furthermore, many of the other harms are associated with the selling of drugs, the trade of drugs in the underground market. There's a lot of gang violence that's fueled by having a criminalized attitude towards drugs. If drugs were legalized, though, and you could just buy cocaine in a Walgreens or a CVS or in some special cocaine shop, you wouldn't have to worry about violence in the streets over the stuff. Just like during the Prohibition era in the US, alcohol was illegal. And when alcohol was illegal, an underground market opened up where people produced liquor in their homes and then sold it and traded it. It became a very kind of violent industry to be in. Of course, you don't have that nowadays because you can legally produce and sell liquor at liquor stores. Right, so the same sort of thing could be applied to drugs too. You might think, well, people have always used drugs, they're always going to use drugs, so why not have a policy that tries to reduce the harms associated with drug use and drug sales? All right, so we have to be careful in how we understand this harm principle because the harm principle doesn't say that a behavior needs to result in guaranteed harm to somebody else in order for the government to have a legitimate reason to outlaw that behavior. Think about like smoking in a restaurant, smoking cigarettes in a restaurant. The harm principle would say the government could totally enact a law that says you can't do that. Because although you're not like necessarily harming somebody else when you do that, you are increasing the likelihood that they will suffer from some disease associated with smoking. Right? Secondhand smoke can be very harmful. Right? Or think about like drunk driving. If you drive drunk, that doesn't guarantee that you're going to harm anybody else, but it does put others at an unacceptably high level of probable harm. We tend to think that just driving in general doesn't put other people at an unacceptably high level of probable harm. Right? There is some chance you can harm somebody else when you're driving sober, but we think when you're driving drunk, now you've exceeded the acceptable level of probable harm to others. Right? So we kind of have to be kind of nuanced in our thinking about the harm principle. It doesn't have to be guaranteed harm. It doesn't have to be probable harm above some kind of acceptability threshold. So that's the harm principle. The other ethical principle that could be brought to bear on questions of drug policy is the paternalism principle. And it says that a government can legitimately enact a law that restricts individual behavior when that behavior typically results in self-harm to the person engaged in the behavior. Right? So the application of this principle to drug policy is very clear. Right? Since drugs are harmful to the user, it's totally legitimate for the government to tell us we can't use drugs. Right? Now, maybe some drugs aren't all that harmful to the user, like marijuana, for instance, not all that harmful. So maybe even the paternalism principle would say there shouldn't be a law against marijuana, but heroin, quite harmful to the user. Alcohol, quite harmful to the user. Cigarettes, quite harmful to the user. And so all of those drugs presumably could be legitimately outlawed by the paternalism principle. But when we're thinking about the paternalism principle, we might think that it involves too much governmental interference in our own personal lives. Because remember what we saw on the first slide in this chapter, the statistics regarding what people sometimes die from in this country. Huge majority of people, 400,000, dying each year of conditions associated with a poor diet or caused by a poor diet. Right? Does that mean that according to the paternalism principle, the government could make it illegal to drink Dr. Pepper or eat Cheetos or eat McDonald's? Maybe. Right? And maybe that's too much governmental interference in our own personal lives. Right? So you can only use one of these principles really to defend a consistent view about what drug policy should be. So you would have to choose like the harm principle or the paternalism principle, or maybe a different principle entirely. But these are some useful ones to consider when thinking about drug policies and which one we should have. All right, finally, let's say a little bit about the debates over gun control. So same set of issues again. On the one hand, you have concern for overall safety and well-being. And then on the other hand, you have a concern for individual choice and freedom. In the US, there currently are a lot of guns. There are more guns than people in the US now. Having access to a gun is quite easy. You can easily purchase one. And our gun violence rates in the US are quite high. It's significantly higher than most other countries in the developed world. Right? So one issue that we're going to think about is whether having gun control in various forms might help to solve problems of gun violence, or maybe even if gun control doesn't solve the problems, it helps to reduce gun violence in this country. Right? There's various proposals, specific proposals that could fall under the heading gun control, and some of them involve radical measures like banning all guns, but not all of them do. Right? So it's really important to say what you have in mind anytime you use the phrase gun control, when you're talking with somebody else, when you're defending the idea or objecting to the idea. It's very important to say what you mean, because some of these proposals are more radical than others. Some of them would seem to violate individual rights and freedoms more so than others. Some of these don't seem to involve any violation of any right at all. Right? So having an absolute ban on guns, for instance, if there's a right to own guns, then an absolute ban would certainly violate that right. Right? But having things like, a universal background check, right, or a ban on a certain kind of gun, or having things like concealed carry permits or requirements to obtain a gun, like you have to take a gun safety course, or you have to have a doctor sign a certificate that says you're not at high risk of gun violence or violence of any kind. These proposals might seem like sensible ways of trying to combat gun violence in our country, and they don't necessarily result in any violation of any right. Right, so let's think about whether or not people do have a right to own guns. Right, in terms of our own Constitution, we don't have to look far to find something relevant to this issue. Right, so the Second Amendment says what it says right here. You can read it. And some arguments that defend the idea that people have a right to own guns appeal to the Second Amendment. It's not clear that this is the strongest kind of argument for gun rights because there are interpretive issues raised by the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment talks about militia service, as you can see, and it's not clear whether it protects an individual right to own a gun or rather a kind of collective right for members of a militia to own guns. Another weak point in this argument is that, well, just because something's written into the Constitution doesn't mean that it's necessarily, morally wrong to not grant people a right that's specified in the Constitution, because of course the Constitution could be a fallible document. Right? If it were perfect, then you wouldn't have to have amendments to it. Right? So the fact that we have amendments to it suggests that maybe it's not perfect. Maybe the Second Amendment isn't perfect. Maybe it should be reworded to protect an individual right, to be precisely clear that there's an individual right protected rather than a collective or state right. Right? And then third issue, the Second Amendment, it doesn't say that people have a right to own any gun. Right? It just says they have a right to own a gun, right? Given that we've sorted out the interpretive issues over is it an individual right or a collective right. It doesn't say that they have a right to own any gun whatsoever. So if you had a form of gun control that involved a ban on assault weapons, for instance, that wouldn't violate the Second Amendment. Right? There's still lots of other guns that you could buy, that you would have a right to buy. Right? Perhaps a more persuasive argument for gun rights rests its case on the right to self-defense. Right, so consider this argument here. Everyone has a right to defend themselves from attacks by others. Owning and using a gun is a legitimate form of self-defense, so everyone has a right to own and use guns. That seems like a valid argument with some fairly plausible premises. Again, just because this argument sort of works, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has a right to own and use any conceivable kind of gun. It would just be has a right to own gun for the purpose of self-defense. Right? That's the legitimate reason specified in the argument. Right? So this argument is importantly different from the appeal to the Second Amendment. Right? This is an ethical argument here on this slide that appeals to just, what we seem to have reason to believe. Right? Do people have a right to defend themselves? Well, sure. Is owning and using a gun a legitimate form of self-defense? Well, sure. Right? So these are just like plausible premises. But even if this argument works, it doesn't suggest that all forms of gun control are ridiculous or are a violation of this right. This is one thing we really, want to appreciate in this chapter, is that the kind of ordinary way in which the gun control debate is framed in our society, which is like, gun rights advocates on one side versus, radical nut jobs on the other who want to take away all guns. Not a very useful way of framing what could be an interesting debate, interesting set of issues concerning, what does the right to self-defense involve? What does the right to own a gun involve? And are these sensible forms of gun control, are they potential possibilities that we could use to help try and curb gun violence in this country? All right, so that's it for chapters 14 and 17. And I suppose that's it in terms of material for our online course.